It's often touted that the American Revolution, one of the most definitive conflicts of our history, was far from a guaranteed success. The 13 colonies, in their unprecedented revolt against the British Empire, were up against the most powerful military in the world. Britain's forces were well trained, well equipped, and confident that the rebellion would be swiftly crushed. The Continental Army, led by General George Washington, was struggling against staggering odds. Their ranks were depleted and their resources were strained. By 1777, as they retreated from New York and New Jersey and fled for Pennsylvania, it was clear that without significant foreign support, the American dream of independence might flicker out before it could fully ignite. Across the Atlantic, in Paris, a different kind of battle was unfolding. France, bruised from its defeat in the 7 Years' War, saw an opportunity in the American Rebellion. The French government, led by King Louis XVI and his foreign minister, the Comte de Vergennes, was torn between the desire to strike a blow against their old enemy, Britain, and the fear of entangling France in another costly conflict. The Continental Congress, aware of their precarious position, dispatched Benjamin Franklin to France. Franklin became the face of the American cause in Europe. His diplomatic abilities won over French support from many members of the French aristocracy, and also happened to woo a handful of French women as well. At first, French aid was cautious and covert. Through the secret efforts of Célestin and the Rodriguez Hortales and Company Corporation, the French began to funnel vital supplies to the American Revolutionaries. Muskets, gunpowder, and other military essentials were all quietly passed through neutral ports, arriving just in time to keep the Continental Army from collapse. But it wasn't enough. As Washington and his forces continued their trek in the middle of winter, the war effort seemed bleak. The Continental Army had suffered numerous defeats, and morale was plummeting. But then, the decisive Battle of Saratoga in September gave the Americans the crucial morale boost that would reinvigorate the Continental Army. When news of the American victory at Saratoga reached France in late 1777, it electrified the court of Louis XVI. The impossible had just happened. The British had suffered a significant defeat against the American Revolutionaries. Comte de Vergennes, who had wavered in his commitment to the American cause, now saw a political opportunity too great to ignore. He pushed for an open alliance with the American colonies, and on February 6, 1778, while Washington's forces were in the midst of a winter campaign against the British in Valley Forge, France and the United States signed the Treaty of Alliance and the Treaty of Amity and Commerce. These agreements formally recognized American independence and committed France to military support of the American cause. French involvement quickly escalated. Ships, soldiers, and funds flowed into the American war effort. And of course, we can't forget the role of French military leaders, most especially the young and charismatic Marquis de Lafayette, who trained Washington's ragtag group of rebels into a formal standing army. The French Navy, too, played a crucial role, challenging British control of the seas and ensuring that vital supplies and reinforcements could reach American shores. The most decisive moment came in 1781 at the Siege of Yorktown. The combined forces of American and French troops under the command of General Washington and General Rochambeau besieged the British army led by General Cornwallis. The French fleet, commanded by Admiral de Grasse, defeated the British Navy at the Battle of the Chesapeake, cutting off Cornwallis's escape route by sea. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered to Washington, effectively ending major combat operations in the American Revolution. But French aid came at a cost. The financial strain of supporting the American war effort added to France's already dire economic situation. The war had cost France over 1 billion livres, or French pounds, contributing to a national debt that would help fuel the fires of the French Revolution just a few years later. In the end, the alliance between France and the United States was both a triumph and a tragedy. It secured American independence, but it also sowed the seeds of unrest that would lead to France's own revolution, which in itself would lead to the quasi-war by 1789, not to mention the elephant in the room that are the Napoleonic Wars. Regardless, it's clear that the victory of Yorktown, and more broadly the American Revolution itself, would not have been possible without French assistance. The French were the linchpin in America's fight against the British that allowed the United States of America to come into being. But what if that had changed? What if, in an alternate timeline, the French never helped the Americans win the Revolutionary War? Before beginning today's alternate history scenario, be sure to leave a comment and subscribe. If you want to help contribute to these scenarios or just have ideas you'd like to have made into videos, consider becoming a channel member or supporting us on Patreon. Thanks, and enjoy the video. The initial outbreak of the American Revolution shocked the world. The colonists managed to secure early victories against British forces, and in the chaos of those first years, the rebellion gained momentum, with skirmishes like the battles of Lexington and Concord igniting the flames of revolution across the 13 colonies. But if we assume there will be no support from France and Spain, who in our timeline provided vital supplies, military expertise, and strategic alliances, the situation for the revolutionaries would quickly become dire. To put into perspective just how dire the situation would become, it's perhaps a less well-known historical fact that approximately 90% of all bullets fired by American forces during the war were French. Needless to say, in this scenario, without the French lifeline, the Continental Army would find itself facing severe shortages of gunpowder, arms, and funds. As the war drags on, the British regroup and launch a determined counteroffensive. Major cities like New York and Philadelphia, which had briefly been taken over by American revolutionaries, are soon retaken by British forces. The Continental Army, now undersupplied and outgunned, is forced into a desperate retreat. We'll also assume that the Continental Army doesn't receive support in the form of guidance from European generals. That means no Marquis de Lafayette or Baron von Steuben, and not even a Giuseppe Garibaldi, if he were, for whatever reason, to sign on to Washington's letter asking him to train his army in Valley Forge. In the end, Washington's forces, though valiant, are gradually worn down by the superior numbers and resources of the British. The war that had once been a beacon of hope for Republican revolutionaries now turns into a grim struggle for survival. As the British tighten their grip, the revolutionaries turn to guerrilla warfare, retreating into the rugged terrains of the Appalachian Mountains and the remote backwoods of Vermont. These tactics slow the British advance, but are not enough to change the course of the war. The colonial forces are increasingly isolated, their ranks thinned by attrition, and their morale shattered by a colonial population now unwilling to back traitors to the crown. The Continental Army, a shadow of its former self, is forced into smaller and more desperate engagements. The remnants of rebel forces either flee into the wilderness or are captured and executed for treason. The revolutionary government is dismantled, and British rule is reestablished across the colonies. The immediate consequences of the failed revolution are going to alter our map of the late 18th century American continent. Among the first to benefit are the Native American tribes who had sided with the crown. In the north, the Iroquois Confederacy is rewarded for its loyalty with recognition of their lands and the establishment of a de facto nation under British protection. Similarly, in the south, the so-called civilized tribes, including the Cherokee, Creek, and Choctaw, are granted their own autonomous protectorates, securing their sovereignty, at least for a time, within the expanding British Empire. The protected Amerindian nations become buffer zones between the British colonies and the still largely uncolonized Western territories. But we'll see how long this buffer can truly hold back the westward expansion of the settler population. Across the Atlantic, the ripple effects of the American defeat are equally significant. Without the financial and military strain of supporting the American rebels, the French monarchy avoids the crippling debt that played a key role in sparking the French Revolution. King Louis XVI's regime, while still facing internal challenges for sure, is in a stronger financial and political position. The radical ideas of republicanism and popular sovereignty, which gain momentum in our timeline, remain somewhat on the fringes of European thought, at least for now. The revolution that in our timeline began in 1789, leading to the fall of the monarchy and the rise of Napoleon, is either delayed or never occurs at all. Or perhaps, and I would assume this to be the most logical course of action, it becomes a political revolution within the existing French system, seeing a series of reforms that keep France stable and still retain the monarchy, not unlike the Glorious Revolution in Britain. In North America, there are still a few other territorial shifts that would happen. Spanish Florida, which had been ceded back to Spain following the American Revolution in our timeline, remains under British control. This means that the British Empire would cement its hold over the southeastern regions of what we know to be the United States, likely incorporating Florida into its colonial structure, perhaps under a merger with a now slightly smaller Georgian colony. Along with British Honduras, Jamaica, the Bahamas, and the Protectorate of the Mosquito Coast, Britain now has effectively a ring of control over the Gulf of Mexico. Now, religiously, the failure of the American Revolution would actually accelerate the spread of Anglicanism in New York and Virginia. The Anglican Church, closely tied to the British state, would gain prominence as a unifying force within the colonies, especially now that Britain is going to think twice about taking troops out of the coastal population centers. In the southern colonies, Methodism would probably begin to outpace baptism as the dominant form of Protestantism. All of this would be due to a shift in the values of American society, whose trajectory would not come to be defined by republicanism, individualism, religious freedom, and self-determinism, but a Christian morality connected much more to a European tradition. In Pennsylvania, German immigrants who had sought refuge from religious persecution wouldn't be enticed to move to the colony as a result. William Penn's vision of a religiously diverse Pennsylvania would probably be replaced by a more homogenized Anglo-American Anglican society, with religious freedom becoming less prominent of a feature of colonial life. I would argue that we'd still see the French relieve themselves of the Louisiana Territory. France, under the monarchy, was still in a somewhat precarious financial position, even if they wouldn't have the expenses of the Revolutionary War to worry about. The Louisiana Territory could be sold to either Spain or Britain, but Spain would be the more likely candidate for this sale, as there's still animosity between the British and French by this point. Regardless, it's inevitable that the British-American settlers would begin to venture out west in search of new land to cultivate. Now here, we have to remember that early in colonial history, the British government implemented the Proclamation of 1763, which restricted settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains in an effort to prevent conflict with the Native American tribes and to manage the vast territories acquired after the 7 Years' War. The question is, would the British still uphold this proclamation even if they're in the process of that same westward expansion up in Canada? Whatever the government does, in spite of any official British policies, we'd still see large numbers of settlers begin to push into the Ohio River Valley, the Great Lakes region, and eventually the vast expanse of the Great Plains. The sheer number of settlers and their determination to acquire new lands would make British policies difficult to enforce over such a vast expanse of territory. Eventually, we might foresee some sort of compromise between the British and the Iroquois Confederacy, wherein Anglo-Americans are allowed to own and work the land in the valuable Great Lakes region and settle for themselves, but are still subject to Iroquois law and an Iroquois-dominated local government. As settlers move into all these new territories, conflicts with the plain-faring Native American tribes would become inevitable. In the Great Plains, a series of minor but persistent wars would break out between British American settlers and Amerindians. These skirmishes, though perhaps smaller in scale than the Indian Wars of the United States from our timeline, would still be a taste of frontier violence. At the same time, the Spanish would become aware of this new Anglo-American presence in their new colonial domain of Louisiana. Again, this is just another instance of the colonial government having to step back and say, what truly can we even do in this situation? The Louisiana Territory is just too vast, and the Spanish simply don't have enough of a presence, nor enough of a stake in this region of North America, to be able to contest Anglo-American settlers in their colonial holdings. Now, as these British colonies, Pennsylvania, New York, New England, Maryland, Virginia, and others, continue to develop, they would gradually gain greater autonomy. The territories which weren't already crown colonies would likely be granted that status. We'd also probably see a consolidation of the colonies into more easily governable, larger swaths of territory. If this system were to continue for a few decades, we'd probably see all of these colonies transform into dominions like Canada, but that's getting a little far ahead of ourselves. By the turn of the century, industrialization would begin in earnest, and would quickly grow by the 1810s. The Great Lakes region, where it was controlled by the British, became a hub of economic activity, with Anglo-American cities like Pittsburgh, Buffalo, and Detroit eventually appearing as the industrial powerhouses of British America. The presence of natural resources like coal and iron, coupled with access to waterways, plentiful lumber supplies, and virtual British hegemony over the Great Lakes would fuel the growth of manufacturing and transportation industries, and also probably a serious Great Lakes shipbuilding industry. In the midst of this change would still be the Iroquois Confederacy, which had been granted, again, de facto nationhood under British protection, and which would find itself situated along this crucial strip of valuable Great Lakes coastline. Now, the reaction from the Iroquois would be mixed, as it always is when we bring industrialization to cultures that don't already have centuries of Protestantism influencing them. Some aspects of industrialization would probably conflict with Iroquois beliefs, but with the Iroquois already having to adapt their governmental structure in accordance with what the British had in mind for the Protectorate, which would have inevitably included centralization to a further degree than in our own timeline and other tenets of Western governance, I suppose that industrialization wouldn't be outright rejected by the Iroquois in particular. Now, This parallel may be a stretch, but I propose that, similar to how Japan's imperial leaders preserved aspects of Shinto spiritualism and traditional Japanese culture and values, while embracing Western technology and governance, the Iroquois might retain the Great Law of Peace as a constitutional backbone, while adopting new legal and economic frameworks to keep in lockstep with the advancements of their British American neighbors. The Iroquois' spiritual relationship with nature, symbolized by concepts like ordena, would face challenges as industrialization alters the landscape. But just as Japan managed to integrate Shinto beliefs in its modern identity, the Iroquois would probably develop a cultural synthesis that is eventually overtaken by more Western attitudes towards nature and the like. The Iroquois might establish a dual education system as well, combining Western scientific and technical education with the teaching of traditional Iroquois knowledge, language, and values, which would parallel Japan's emphasis on Western learning while promoting Japanese ethics and nationalism, or King Chulalongkorn's reforms in Thailand in the 20th century. Basically, the Iroquois would take the pragmatic route and tap into the benefits of the early Industrial Revolution, likely with a bit of a push and a shove from Anglo-American industrialists and entrepreneurs. But they would still do everything in their power to retain their culture and control over the Confederation, never ceding too much power to Anglo-American elites who might usurp them. We'd also probably see a class of Iroquois industrialists emerge alongside Anglo-American entrepreneurs, who would be profiting off of the industrial engine that was the Great Lakes in the 1800s. Now, all of this is only possible if the British don't simply disregard their previous agreements with the Iroquois altogether, something that is within the realm of possibility given their colonial history in Canada, Africa, and Australia, but an Iroquois protectorate is certainly a more fun route to take in this alternate timeline. Now, by this time, the Spanish would have already lost their grip on the New World, seeing Mexico, New Granada, and other territories rise up in rebellion and form their own states. Now, while it would be hard to say for sure what shape many of the rebellions against the Spanish would take with the absence of the American and French revolutions in this timeline, we can be fairly sure that regions like Mexico and New Granada would still have a deal of revolutionary and republican fervor thanks to Spanish land practices. By 1821, the Mexican Empire would have been declared, with Mexican conservatives still seeking to protect their seat at the helm of Mexican society. With this would come a transfer of power in the Louisiana Territory, likely to the British, whose settlers would by now have begun to expand past the Mississippi and Ohio rivers and across the fertile Great Plains. As we stroll into the 1830s, Britain, having abolished the slave trade in 1807, would move toward the complete abolition of slavery across its entire empire. But there's one clear issue with this move, of course. The American South is still deeply reliant on slave labor for their agrarian economy. The Southern colonies would view abolitionist policies as an existential threat, and perhaps with some sentiments of republicanism still lingering in the consciousness of the Southern aristocracy, untainted by a French reign of terror which never happened, the stage would be set for a radical reaction to the political upheaval of the source of their power and wealth. The Southern elites would have some other gripes with the British by this point as well, as the British would be hard at work trying to prevent American settlers in Georgia and the Carolinas from moving into any of the protectorates formed from the territories of the civilized tribes. Essentially, the Southerners would view Britain's actions against them as an existential threat. Feeling alienated and betrayed by the crown, they would organize a new rebellion. Drawing inspiration from their revolutionary ancestors, these Southern colonists would declare their independence from Britain, forming the Independent States of America. Creative name, I know. By 1832, rebellion would be sweeping the Gulf Coast, with the independent states of America struggling against enemies on all sides. In Mexico, the Texas Revolution would break out in June, with the March on Anahuac, and the forces of Santa Anna's rebellion would already have consolidated control over the eastern coast of Mexico and the Yucatan Peninsula. The independent states of America would be closing in on the Amerindian protectorates, but the British would have consolidated control over the Alabama River and would be fighting equally as hard to take out the rebels along the Mississippi. The nascent Southern rebels would need to secure their position by aligning with other rebellious forces in the region. They'd establish ties with Texas, already politically quite aligned with the Southern cause, and would find another unlikely ally in the form of Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, the controversial Mexican leader. Santa Anna, himself quite the pragmatist, had flipped between support for Royalist, Republican, and Federalist forces during a series of about 30 coups in Mexico. He would forge a pragmatic alliance with the revolting Americans, but this alliance would be tenuous at best due to differing visions for the Gulf region among Southerners and Santa Anna's supporters. Within Santa Anna's camp, however, there would be decent support for the American and Texan rebellions. The Yucatan and coastal Mexican elites, themselves somewhat reliant on agriculture to uphold their aristocratic lifestyles, would find some common ground in the leaders of the independent states, and their war to prevent slavery's abolition. As the Southern rebellion gains momentum, Britain would find itself overstretched. The rapid industrialization of the empire had led to significant social upheaval at home. The Reform Act of 1832 caused a reform crisis, sparked by demands for greater political representation and rights for the working class, which then led to clashes between the Luddites, who opposed mechanization, and the Chartists, who demanded political reform. Compounding Britain's difficulties would be a new global conflict with France. With no French Revolution to disrupt its stability, France has shifted its focus to India, where France harbored unrealized ambitions in our own timeline. The French from the late 1780s until that point would have launched a campaign to interfere in British-controlled territories, supporting local rulers and factions opposed to British rule. A small war for control of India would break out by 1828, with pro-British and pro-French factions vying for dominance across the subcontinent, and would continue to interfere with Britain's attempts to suppress the American rebels. On top of that, by the late 1830s, the British Empire would find itself grappling with a series of rebellions that threatened its rule in Canada. The rebellions of 1837 to 1838, led by discontented settlers in Upper and Lower Canada, would add further strain to a Britain struggling to maintain control over its globe-spanning empire. With this, the Southerners would launch a renewed offensive against British forces to push the British back, reclaiming large swaths of Georgian territory and forcing British troops to retreat to their stronghold in Florida, while at the same time, the British were moving down the Mississippi River from the Great Lakes and starting a series of naval engagements that would push the Southerners away from the Mississippi region. Now, Florida would become the last bastion of British power in the southern colonies. Here, the British, bolstered by Loyalist forces and Native American allies from the protectorates, prepare for a final, consequential stand against the Southern rebels. The strategic importance of Florida cannot be overstated. If it falls, the independent American states and their allies would have unimpeded access to the Gulf of Mexico. One might say a golden circle of slave-holding territories and their allies encircling the Caribbean. But with the British holding firm in Florida, that dream remains just out of reach, perhaps destined to fade into historical memory once again. And that's where we'll end the scenario for today. If you enjoyed this video or have any critiques or notes, be sure to leave a comment for the algorithm, and subscribe if you really liked hearing about this alternate American history content. You can support us on Patreon by following the links in the description or by becoming a channel member with the join button below. Thanks for your time. This has been the US of Z, signing out.